And Kristen, I was wondering, since this is a small enough group, would it be worthwhile to do introductions? I mean, I know you and David, but that's about it.
Sure.
Yeah, why don't Robin, why don't you start, and then Angie and Alex and Mary? Oh, and Brett. All right. Get a few more in here. And Lori.
Introductions. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Robin Paoni. I'm up in Whitefish. And yeah, thank you so much, Kyle, for being here today. So I am a co-leader of the Flathead Valley Citizens Climate Lobby chapter and also a state coordinator for Montana.
Okay.
And I'm very interested in this topic. So thank you.
Hi, Kyle. My name is Angie Winter, and I also live in the Flathead Valley west of Kalispell, and I'm one of the co-leaders. There's actually three of us, and very excited and grateful for this opportunity today.
Lori?
Hi, Lori Byron from Billings, Montana. Also grateful to have you here today. Thank you.
Mary?
Hi, Kyle. Mary Mulcair-Jones. I'm the group leader for the CCL Missoula chapter.
Brett?
Hi, Kyle. I'm Brett Lidke. I'm the third part of the Three Musketeer co-leadership up in the Flathead Valley. So I'm also in Whitefish working with Angie and Robin. So yeah,
Okay.
very interested to hear what you have to say.
And Hattie, we're doing introductions. Would you like to introduce yourself quick?
Sure. I'm Hattie Hobart. I am the Western Regional Director for the American Conservation Coalition. And Alex and I have been working together to write op-eds kind of generally on sustainability. And this month, I think we're going to focus on transmission lines. And that's also something that ACC has focused on pretty heavily throughout our advocacy as well.
Got it.
And I'm Alex Eminette, and I've been working with Hattie on op-eds. And I am also the liaison to Senator Steve Daines for Citizens Climate Lobby here in Montana. So I really need to get up on my game on understanding transmission and permitting reform because, as you know, CCL is lobbying on the Big Wires Act. And so really appreciate your expertise and time for this, Kyle. Thanks.
Great. So we'll be taking questions in the chat, if you don't mind, and then we can make them fit with what topic is coming up. And it'll be, we possibly can just have you raise your hand and chime in too. That'll be just fine. And we'll be putting in the chat some helpful acronyms. So that might help with some of the translation here. Dave, you want to start us off?
You bet. So yeah, thanks. Kyle and Kristen and I met and visited just before Christmas and looking at setting this up. So the way we're going to go is we've got a series of questions that we want to ask Kyle to lead us through the topic. And as Kristen said, pop a question into the chat and we'll do that. If it fits in later, then she'll moderate that and we'll address that a little bit later as the topic comes up. And so we're focused on learning from Kyle about the current state of the grid in the US and in Montana and find out how enhancing regional transmission is and why it's so important in improving the grid reliability, helping reduce the cost of electricity, and increasing the deployment of clean electricity. And then a key part is what are some of the barriers to improving that transmission system so we can meet all of those objectives. And then we're intending to have some time for Q&A. So that's what the focus is. So I'll go ahead and start off. So Kyle, let's just start with the basics. What's the difference between transmission and distribution? We see that on our utility bill, but what is it?
Thanks, David. For those of you who do not know who I am, my name's Kyle Unruh. I work for Renewable Northwest, which is a 501c3 advocacy organization. Our members are clean energy developers and environmental organizations, and a few large energy purchasers like Amazon and Google. And we operate in the Northwest, hence our name. Before that, I worked for Northwestern Energy. And so Renewable Northwest and Northwestern both have keen interests in transmission. So this has been part of my work for a little bit of time. So I can certainly get you up to speed on the basics, and I hope this is useful. So thanks for the question, Dave. Transmission and distribution are widely considered separate segments of the bulk electric system. Generally speaking, transmission lines are larger lines over longer distances. Distribution lines are smaller lines that operate within a particular locality. And they're separated by substations that scale up and down the voltage. So voltage is scaled up to go over the large transmission lines over long distances, and then scaled back down to go over the smaller lines and distribution systems. We'll keep this Montana centric, but if anyone has questions about the larger footprint, let me know. But speaking of Montana, so every city in Montana, as an example, has its own distribution system. Those are the power lines you see running through town. And they require their own planning and reliability maintenance and vegetation maintenance and all that. And they're all connected to a substation, one or more substations. And then as I mentioned, that substation is either ramping up or down the voltage to connect to transmission. And the reason transmission is necessary is because the generation of electricity is most of the time not anywhere near where the electricity is being used. And so those larger lines over long distances are serving the purpose of transporting the electricity from the point of generation to the point of use, or we would say from the source to the sink.
All right, that's great. So now can you give us kind of the 30,000 foot level overview of transmission in the US? And Kristen's going to post a link in the chat so you guys can be looking at that along the way.
Yeah, so the United States has one bulk electric system, and I believe it's the largest machine in the world, continuously operating machine in the world. So it's an amazing engineering feat. It takes an amazing amount of labor and expertise to keep it running efficiently and to maintain it. But that system doesn't have an equal level of interconnectedness throughout. And so there are particular seams that are not very well connected with each other. And those seams draw the lines between three segments of the bulk electric system. And those are the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and ERCOT, which is Texas's grid. And we'll be talking a lot about interconnectedness today, but as a result of a lack of interconnectedness at those seams, our ability to move power between interconnections is severely limited. And wherever we have limited interconnection or seams like this, usually there's congestion, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But so in essence, the bulk electric system in the United States is split into three parts. And there is a need for greater connection between those parts. And those, we may be getting to this later, but I'll just preview it. the way those interconnections, so Eastern, Western, and ERCOT are operated, are very different. The Eastern interconnection is operated largely by regional transmission organizations and independent system operators. We call those RTOs and ISOs. So large organizations that have a very large footprint and can optimize over that footprint. Whereas the Western interconnection is balkanized and is operated by many different balancing authorities with their own interests and own assets. So we'll get into that later, but that's to say there are significant differences between the segments of the bulk electric system in the US.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So when you were with Northwestern Energy, you were a transmission market analysis. So this transmission stuff was part of your area of work. Can you explain a little bit more about how the transmission system operates and the energy markets, and trying to make sure the lights go on every time we flip the switch?
Right, yeah. Well, as I was mentioning earlier, operating the bulk electric system as a whole, just generally speaking, is difficult. They're essentially the frequency of electricity on the lines has to stay at 60 hertz at all times. It can deviate a small amount over short periods of time, but it really has the generation on one side of the line and the demand on the other side of the line have to exert the force between those, and the electricity between those has to maintain that 60 hertz and instantaneously all the time. So it's again, it's quite the engineering feat that this happens, and we are able to turn on our lights at any point. And in order to make that happen from a transmission perspective, the transmission system operates both on a commercial basis and on a physical basis. And there are teams of people that work on the commercial operation and on the physical operation. So starting on the commercial side, this is a matter of linking up transmission service providers, or TSPs, like Northwestern Energy, for example, to customers and transmission customers, those people who need to move energy from the point of generation to the point it's being used, or from the source to the sink. And those basically contracts are put in place for transmission service reservations. And those contracts allow the customers the right to use X capacity on the transmission line during X period of time. They're not obligated to use it, and whether or not they use it is determined at a sort of second stage in the commercial process, which is scheduling the transmission. But so there's the reservation, and then if the customer shows up to use it, they schedule it, and then they use it, presumably. That creates a model for the transmission service provider of how their lines are going to be used into the future, and so they don't oversubscribe the lines, because as you might imagine, these transmission lines have physical limits. They can only transport so much electricity at the same time, and that depends on the size of the line. You might have heard of it, like our 500 kilovolt lines in Montana, or our 260 kilovolt, et cetera. Those refer to the amount of energy the line can transport. So anyway, there's this commercial queuing and then utilization. And then outside of that, physical operations, what actually ends up flowing on the lines, believe it or not, does not match what was scheduled on a commercial basis. At times it's approximate, and at times it doesn't even resemble what was scheduled. And the reason for that is insofar as, even though we'd like to be able to perfectly predict what the demand will be on one end and what the generation will be on the other end, when you add in all of the rest of all the transmission lines that affect X line we're concerned with, and all the generation and demand at the end of those lines, the deviations that result, the number of variables is too high, and the deviations, there are always deviations. And so the actual flow of energy just doesn't match the schedules, essentially. And so there are transmission operators who are looking at that physical flow, and it's their job. They're the ones who are looking at what we call area control error, or ACE, that's 60 hertz, and whether or not there's a deviation in the frequency and what needs to be done, either at the substation level or with generation to balance that. And so I guess that's pretty good overview of how transmission operates at a high level. Markets help with all of this. Markets attempt to expand the scope of cooperation and optimization of both the generation and transmission assets. That's to say, they increase the footprint. So again, just with the Montana focus, before there was a real-time market in the West, which we'll talk about in a minute, Northwestern Energy they looked at their own transmission, their own generation, their own native load or demand for electricity. And they worked to balance all the variables and maintain that frequency on their lines at all times. And they would also bilaterally contract with entities outside of their balancing authority in order to procure additional energy or additional transmission to move that additional energy. But that was it. That's it. So their primary footprint was, segments of Montana and South Dakota and Nebraska, with markets such as the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the WEAM, that CAISO operates. That footprint is now, 20 times bigger, 30 times bigger. Much of the West subscribes to that real-time market. And as a matter of subscribing, all the entities who participate submit all this data about the generation they can offer into the market at X intervals, and the transmission they offer to the market, and all this stuff to the market operator, which is the California ISO. And the California ISO takes all this data from across this huge footprint and optimizes, and then sends dispatch orders essentially for generation, and sets up the transmission schedules and all that. So there's a much larger bucket of resources and transmission available as a result of markets. And the result is just more efficient operation of the system, greater access to energy, greater access to transmission. It's even though it takes a lot of work to set up a market and to for every entity involved in the market to become capable of operating in it, to have the systems and the coordination with CAISO, that's a lot of work. But once it's all in place, the benefits are large.
How long has Northwestern been part of that market system?
They joined the Western, not long. They joined the Western Energy Imbalance Market. I want to say it was June 2022. I mean, it really hasn't been long. And the WEAM, that Western Energy Imbalance Market, has only been around maybe since 2020. So this is all new stuff. And it comes as a result of a recognition for the need for greater geographic diversity and sharing in the ways I was describing.
And that WEAM is looking to balance like 5 minutes ahead. Is that right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, so the WEIM, WEAM, operated by CAISO, is a quote unquote real-time market, which means in the 5-minute time frame. So they're taking all that data 5 minutes ahead, they're running it through algorithms and spitting out the optimizations for real time.
So this was kind of mind-blowing when I first learned about this, from folks. And that old saying, the devil's in the details, is really true. And the more you know, the more impressive it is that electricity works every time you flip the switch. You gave us a little bit of background on the Eastern versus the Western. Let's focus more on the Western interconnection. And Kristen's got a cool slide that shows the complexity there that Kyle alluded to, and you can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Are we able to, I mean, can I share my screen and, or so people can see this slide? Let me see if I can get there.
Is this the slide that
Yeah, you got
wanted
it.
to show?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
So, the West, this is a schematic of the Western interconnection, and it shows the number of balancing authorities that operate in the West. So that's to say that every acronym you see on the screen here has a footprint that they are responsible for balancing in terms of balancing generation and load and the transmission. Many of these, or most of these, also own assets. They own the transmission and or the generation. And so they have interests. And not only do they operate, but they're also companies. So they have interests in what's built and how it's operated and utilized and where we go with markets and all the rest. And so the result is, you know, basically a divided West. And it makes, as you might imagine, it makes it very hard. If we're talking transmission development, transmission moves over large distances. Well, where can you move on this map over large distances without crossing, you know, many different acronyms? Well, nowhere. So as a result, there's just so much coordination that's needed between these balancing authorities. The good news is that at this point, and for a couple years at least, there's been, I'd say, essentially universal recognition that transmission needs to be built, and it needs to be built now. But that doesn't change the fact that it's still difficult, and different entities have their own interests and their own capabilities and et cetera. So, yeah, the East, as I mentioned earlier, is not this way. They have RTOs and ISOs. Basically, to imagine, you could look at this footprint and imagine like 3 entities. That's the East. And the West is much more complex.
And so with those RTOs and their markets, you know, we talked about the 5-minute market. Does the East have like day ahead markets that they are working with, or do they already have that kind of situation in place?
Well, because they operate as RTOs and ISOs, and those footprints, so one RTO's footprint is so large, they're essentially operating their own market over a large footprint for that RTO. And they do it in all time frames. They do it 20 years ahead, 5 years ahead, 1 year ahead, 1 month ahead, 1 day ahead, and in real time. I mean, they're doing all the planning and all the operation over every time frame to optimize for the footprint. And they have, again, because there are fewer different entities, they have way fewer seams between their markets. And so the coordination that's needed to move energy or to contract for generation between these seams is much less than it is at what you're looking at on the screen. And so I'd say that another way of saying that is the establishment of the real-time market in the West, and we're looking to do a day-ahead market, is all in an effort, in my view, to move the West to a single RTO like they have in the East. So that what the East has right now is basically the goal in the West.
So the next question, and I think we'll get to that, is so focusing on the West and those 38 different entities, how's that working? You've alluded to that, you know.
I mean, it's I don't know. I don't want to make any sweeping statements necessarily, but I already alluded to the challenges. It's just when it comes to transmission development, it's very hard to find sufficient number of partners with the level of interest needed to build large transmission lines. across large distances. And then that's compounded by, dealing with the Bureau of Land Management, and if there's private property involved, all the landowners who inevitably don't want the transmission on their land. And it's just really, really hard. I think it's been demonstrated actually that an RTO that has a much larger footprint, kind of like MISO, for example, which sits to the east of SPP, which is directly to the east of us, they are building a lot of transmission, and they got, I think it was $10 billion of transmission investment approved for the next 4 or 5 years. And that's because they operate this huge footprint, and they can plan for that huge footprint and get it done. There is regional transmission planning required in the West by region. The Northwest does this through Northern Grid, but it's basically checking off a box. And that's to say, all the balancing authorities in the Northwest submit their data, so what generation they have, what they see coming, what transmission they have, to Northern Grid. And Northern Grid takes all the data and, in coordination with these entities, comes up with a plan and says, well, transmission in these areas would be beneficial. But this has been going on for 20 years, and we haven't had a single major project that's come out of the process. So it is an effort, but it's just not working.
And so let's zoom in specifically to Montana and how our transmission is working, and
Sure.
What the problems are there, or
Yeah,
opportunity.
Yeah, the next slide there, I think has the WEC paths for Montana. Yep. So these arrows represent the major transmission paths in and out of Montana. They're referred to as path 8, 18, 80, and 83. The largest path, as you can see, is path 8, which leads to the west. It allows to export of 2,200 megawatts at any given moment, an import of 1,350. And as you might imagine, it's our primary connection to the load centers on the coast, so Seattle and Portland and the whole I-5 corridor. And then path 18 runs down through Idaho and connects with Pacific Core and Idaho Power's systems, and which they have been building out in significant ways through the Gateway project you could read more about, and others. And then on the southeast side of the state, we have path 80. This connects us down into Wyoming, essentially. And it has issues frequently because of Wyoming wind. And we should talk more about variable generation like wind and the challenges that they bring. But path 80 is constrained oftentimes. And then path 83 up north is connection to Alberta. And it's not particularly high capacity, but it is also fairly highly utilized. And then we do have as he noted there, a tie to North Dakota, but again, it's pretty small. I could spend hours just talking about these paths, but just know that these are the existing connections, and particularly path 8, 18, and 80 are largely subscribed already. There's not existing capacity, or very much at all existing capacity, for new business or new reservations on those. And so they're given the state of load growth and variable generation and whatnot, I think there really is a need to expand the capabilities.
All right. So let's now talk about, and you just alluded to it, with the wind and the variable. Let's talk about how transmission and increased transmission and additional planning between all these different entities could help with Montana's energy needs, both to meet our peak demands as well as being able to produce, take advantage of our, tremendous wind resource and to be able to send electricity out. You just kind of identified that, yeah, we've got these existing lines, but for the most part, they're pretty plugged up. So
Yeah.
talk about kind of increased transmission potential and planning and how that would fit together.
Sure. Well, it's probably worth at this point taking another step back to a high level view. So you all are probably aware, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, wind and solar generation are highly variable and they're not dispatchable. And as you might imagine, given our discussion of how the electric system is operated, that presents a real challenge for operating, because we're having, as soon as you hook up particularly a large, let's say, wind facility to the grid, it's going to contribute anywhere from 0 to whatever, 500-600 megawatts of energy at any moment. And that has to be balanced so that 60 hertz on the lines is maintained at all times. So something on the other end of that 600 megawatts or 0 megawatts has to shift to maintain the balance on the lines. Where there is significant build out of what we call variable energy resources, namely mostly wind and solar, there is this balancing challenge. And when the energy can't be balanced, it essentially gets cut off. It gets what we call curtailed. It gets curtailed at whatever point on the system it can't be transported any further. And so on Path 80, for example, that connection in Montana to the southeast to Wyoming, that happens very frequently, where wind is being curtailed because it has nowhere to go and it can't get over the lines. Wherever curtailment is happening, there is essentially 0 marginal cost electricity that is not making it to consumers. And so by definition, we're increasing prices for consumers insofar as we're curtailing the energy. In addition to curtailment, where there's insufficient transmission, there can be congestion. And what congestion is technically is a differential in pricing on one side of the transmission line versus the other side, because not enough energy can move. And congestion also increases costs for consumers. And so the high level point here is that as the amount of variable generation, namely wind and solar, increases on the system, the need for either transmission to carry it to where it can be used, or batteries to store the energy and dispatch it as would be optimal, is greater. And we're seeing a lot of wind development in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho, and also I think in Washington and Oregon, and significant solar as well. So again, this is a real challenge, and it's hard to say, with certainty what the best solution is. But I think there's little doubt that identifying priority transmission projects would essentially decrease the cost of energy for consumers in Montana and elsewhere. And then the other piece I'd add is, unlike Montana, California, well, let's just say Oregon and Washington have policy mandates to go to 100% clean electricity in their own respective timeframes. And they are large demand centers with respect to Montana. And because they have this mandate, their utilities recognize that in these timeframes, they can only procure electricity that comes from, clean resources in certain timeframes in the future. And so Montana is basically part of that picture. And being able to move electricity west will, of course, benefit Washington and Oregon consumers and their utilities. But of course, it can also benefit Montana due to the development, the economic development in the state, and property tax and community benefits and all the rest. So so that's all to say. We're undergoing an energy transition, regardless of what you may hear, and the types of generation that are coming online have the potential to be very low cost because their marginal production cost is zero. But they do need to be connected, and the bigger the footprint over which they're connected, the better they can be optimized for sending the energy to where it's needed.
So there's a slide showing the ranking of regions in their planning and delivery in the West that kind of reflects the complexity and the lack of connection.
Yeah.
And so that gets us at the current state of things isn't really good over most of the West. And
Dave,
so
would you like to maybe get to some questions too?
Yep, absolutely.
Can we just start there? Oh, well.
You got some?
Yeah, we have quite a few.
I bet.
Yeah. One of the first was from Robin, did wholesale energy costs come down for Northwest Energy when they joined the Western Energy electric imbalance market?
That's a good question about average costs. I'd say yes on the whole. If you look all things equal, the cost of electricity they've procured since EIM has seen a downtick, but there are many other variables in the cost of electricity that makes its way to Montana consumers, and those costs have, as you saw in the rate increase, have made up the difference. But that's to say, yes, I probably didn't explain this clearly. Where there are cost savings for energy procured in the market, those flow directly to consumers, and there have been significant cost savings.
And so if we could build upon this 5-minute market to a day ahead market and ultimately to a seasonal, kind of market that can plan out and look at that's am I correct in thinking that's where the generality that increased transmission could end up saving money for ratepayers?
Yeah, right. So the positive force that markets bring to transmission development is greater aggregation of data over a much larger footprint to study and understand the need for transmission at certain points. So when you have a market operating this huge footprint, you can see exactly where the congestion is and exactly where we could have used generation or we could have used transmission. And so just the transparency of the transmission issues is much greater when a market's in place. That said, while the West remains balkanized in this way with 30 plus, 35 plus balancing authorities, we're still going to have planning challenges, which is why I think there's basically consensus among people who do this work in the West that it's in everyone's best interest to move the West towards a single RTO, or at least a much smaller number of entities. so that entity can optimize for its huge footprint and plan transmission for its huge footprint and just get it done. Right now, by contrast, like let's take Northwestern Energy, for example, they just don't have the capability to themselves to plan and build a major transmission project. They would realistically have to partner with Pacific or someone much larger or multiple entities. So,
Hey, Kristen, you
yeah.
got other questions?
Sure. One was about energy storage. Does that fit into the EIM in terms of balancing energy storage providers? And I know that Absaroka Energy was thinking about for 2032 maybe having a line going from Great Falls down to the 500 kilovolt line, and they are the big storage people with the height, the water storage. I forget what you
The
call
hydro,
that, but
hydro storage.
hydro, yeah. So how does that fit into the energy imbalance market?
Sure. Well, energy storage or well, it doesn't have to be. Energy storage can be a number of things. It could be batteries. It could be pumped hydro. I think there's gravity storage and other things coming online. But in any case, most of it is batteries. So if I say batteries, I mean energy storage. They're conventionally used as generation assets, even though they don't just produce. Obviously, they absorb and then dispatch. But those are assets in a market that are disclosed to the market operator with certain capabilities at certain times. And the market, again, that market operator aggregates that with the rest of their large set of data, and they optimize utilization of that asset for purposes of the market. So it's basically like any other generating asset in the eyes of the market. Yeah, south of Great Falls does experience significant congestion in Montana and increased transmission in that area, all the way down to Colstrip perhaps, or to the 500 kV would, I'm sure, be useful. Another thing that it's probably a little beyond the scope of this conversation, but batteries or storage can also be used as a transmission asset, not as generation. So it can basically lessen the burden on a given transmission path by charging and then discharging at the right times to reduce the peak on that particular line. So yeah, I mean, storage has a role to play. It's worth noting that it's fairly new on the bulk electric system, and and you all may have seen the charts, but it's rapidly ramping up. But it's particularly for entities like Northwestern Energy, there's a comfort problem there. It's like they've never used a battery, and they have to be certain it'll work, and so they're tentative. But there are CAISO, California, as an example, or and Nevada and Washington, they all operate batteries, and sometimes in large numbers of batteries successfully. So batteries are a huge part of the picture, and what they end up costing and their capabilities into the future will have a lot to do with what ends up being deployed.
So Brett had a good question on this idea of forming a West-wide RTO. Is that strictly a voluntary thing that all these 35 plus entities have to decide they're going to come to the table, or are there, incentives or requirements? What are the carrots and sticks?
Yeah. Well, it varies by jurisdiction, essentially. So Nevada, as an example, has mandated that every utility in its state seriously consider and present to the commission its plans to join an RTO within, I think, 2 years from now, something like that. So that there's a public interest in Nevada. And I think there's similar efforts being made in Washington and Oregon. Outside of like the policy or regulatory realms, I would say that every one of these 35 plus balancing authorities find their jobs much more difficult now than they did even 5 years ago because of all the variable resources coming online and trying to figure out how to balance them at reasonable cost. And also, everyone also recognizes that more transmission development is needed, and an RTO does it much better than 35 plus entities trying to coordinate. So because of those things, I personally haven't talked to anybody who works at any utility who's just not who is not open to an RTO. They all tend to think, well, as long as we can continue to own the assets and just participate, that would probably be better. So anyway, luckily, and definitely for the better, everyone seems to be aligned in recognizing that the benefits of a much larger footprint and centralized operation of that footprint are just enormous and should be pursued.
So looking at the time, Kristen, I'm thinking that we might use that topic as a little bit of a segue to talk about the Big Wires Act.
Big Wires Act, right. So clearly transmission is needed. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has only started to, well, in 2011, put out the Order 1000, which was to try to get regions to cooperate. And clearly that hasn't worked very well. And so what people are looking at is saying, well, FERC, could you please mandate something? We need to get this process going. And the Big Wires Act is a beginning for that by making, let me show you guys are with CCL shows, so you probably already seen, takes me a while to get this to turn over here, that it's basically going to require interregional transfer capacity to increase by 15%. Of our for us in the West, we have a really low peak load capacity of interregional transfer. So we're probably just going to be adding 15% onto what we already do. But what you can see here is how little with this map, how little interregional and even intra-regional transfer capacity there is. So having them have to all the regions cooperate and start planning is going to be a really great first step, and to actually getting things going. And then there's a bunch of other things that a lot of people think could really also help, and that is finding its way into legislation that's being considered, like getting better cost allocation. So who's going to be paying for these lines, getting standards for that. So there's to really work on these thorny problems. The Big Wires Act does appear to be a really great first step.
So
I think we can
go ahead. I was going to say, Kyle, you mentioned that a lot of these 38 entities have traditionally had their own generation, a lot of their own generation, and they would balance things. And so if they had increased demand, then they would increase generation. They build this, they get a certain return. So in terms of a business side of this, if the Big Wires Act got passed and these entities are required to increase their transmission, is it correct to think that every time they invest in a certain share of a new transmission line, they're still going to get their, 10 or 12% profit on that investment? And we're trying to get to understand the business economic side of it.
Sure. Yeah. And Brett asked a similar question just now in the chat. And the answer is yes. Whenever Northwestern Energy makes a capital investment in an asset that it owns, it receives a guaranteed return. I think it's around 9% or 8.5% now, something like that. And so they're incentivized to do that. The challenge is, if we're talking about transmission, the amount of planning, the amount of study and then planning and then permitting and process and public relations and all of that is just outside of what they can do. And so in order to realistically have a major transmission project, they would likely have to partner either with a major transmission developer who just does development, or with a large utility like Pacificor or one of the other West Coast utilities, or more than one. And then in addition to that, it's worth considering too that, in the years that I worked with Northwestern, their whole budget for transmission improvements was something like, I don't know, 150, let's say $150 to $300 million a year. And a major transmission line is going to cost anywhere from $10 to $20 billion. And so it's just outside of the scope of their balance sheet, essentially. It's just so large, which speaks to this idea that, again, an RTO would better be able to accomplish that. That's not to say developing transmission in Montana is impossible. It's just to say Northwestern's interest in that is limited because they don't have the capability to plan for it, and they don't really have the capital to fund it. Another thing I wanted to mention that we didn't bring up that's sort of foundational to all of this, like why transmission is important and why this is all changing with variable energy resources, wind and solar, is that if you look at the Western United States, the natural resource, the wind and the sun, are present in greater quantities in different locations, which are very far apart. And generally speaking, the desert Southwest, as you might imagine, has tons of sun. And as you move north, particularly getting into Wyoming, Montana, the wind is greater. And the correlation and output between these things is not one. That's to say they produce energy at different times, and to the extent they're not correlated, they can cover the demand of X location effectively, even though individual plants are variable. If you aggregate them over a huge footprint, something's running all the time. That's the idea. And so transmission enables the connectivity to make that happen.
And I guess building off of what you said is that generation, but also the peak demand shifts geographically.
Right. Yeah.
Arizona,
California. On the demand side, that's worth pointing out. So as the sun's setting in California, the wind may be blowing in Wyoming, or the sun may be shining in Texas or Arizona, and that helps them get over that peak 6 p.m., 7 p.m. peak before the demand comes back down. And another side that we didn't talk about that's also very important is just the nature of demand or load. Peak loads are increasing, energy use in general is increasing. So that's also part of the challenge.
Angie had a question. can a utility like Northwestern refuse to connect to variable resources to the grid?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So any balancing authority. So if an entity is designated as a balancing authority for a certain footprint, they are obligated to operate the system in an unbiased fashion and balance for whoever wants to connect. That said, of course, they can't just connect everything all the time because the system only has so much capacity. And there are costs to interconnect to the grid. So to build the infrastructure to go from the generating facility to the transmission lines, namely a new substation and lines in between. So, and if the facility is big enough, there may even need to be upgrades to the transmission lines to accommodate the new energy. So what happens is, yes, the direct answer is yes, they're obligated to connect all the resources, but they pass those costs along to the developers or whoever's building. And oftentimes, because there's no latent capacity on the system, those costs are enormous. And so the projects don't get built. And this all speaks to the need for building out more transmissions. So there is capacity so projects can get built. But again, it's not Northwestern's only interest in doing that really is to get the transmission revenue that would result from those projects, which is significant, but it's not necessarily enough to have them hire more people and build and take on this huge transmission issue.
So did you see Lori's question?
Lori, do you want to ask it?
Oh.
Yeah, so not really related to the RTO, et cetera, and maybe it's not fair to ask this, so just say you don't want to answer, but is there any other energy providers who have resisted the future as badly as Northwest Energy?
Yeah, there are.
And refuse to, like to not encourage energy efficiency, the cheapest form of, helping our energy bills, those sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first I'd say it's important to recognize Northwestern has a difficult job, like I've tried to point out along the way here. And they do something. They do have an energy efficiency program, but I would agree with you that they can definitely do more. There are other entities that are sort of aligned, like Basin Electric Cooperative is an example, that they're probably even worse, frankly. I saw their presentation to the legislature and it was basically, well, the Biden administration has these emission rules that are going to shut us down, but we don't care. We're going to burn fossil fuels to the bitter end. And anyway, so there are those other entities out there and they tend to map, as you might imagine, with the politics of their region. I mean, what I'd say is again, I think the best approach with Northwestern is to acknowledge the difficult job they have, acknowledge the tremendous change that's happening, and do what we can to help them come along. And for instance, they're interested in markets. They share this view of an RTO in the future. They have a net zero plan, although it's not really substantiated. So it's insofar as we can sort of help them and give them expertise and help them define a long-term vision, hopefully that'll help.
Wow, the time has gone by pretty quickly. We really want to thank you, Kyle, for spending your Friday afternoon with us. If we have more questions, can we contact you? And
oh, sure.
And
yep.
I know Hattie had a question I didn't get to about the permitting. I wasn't quite sure what you wanted to ask, but we can pass these along to you, and completely thank you for helping us out here.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And thanks for all your work. I know you're out there getting it done. So I'm happy to help wherever I can.
I hope you love your new job.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm just getting started, but it'd be great.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Good to meet
Kyle.
you.
Happy New
Kyle.
Year, everyone.
Yeah, have a great weekend.